They hid the entrance, the CIA's final warning. The wall shouldn't have been warm. At -40, your breath turns to glass and even steel feels dead. But when the technician laid his glove against the ice near the flagged no-step box, heat bled through. He flinched, then pressed again. It was a thin band, like someone had drawn a line of fever inside the glacier. 30 seconds later, the station siren cut the night, and the corridor to the western crevasse sealed. The memo line looked harmless at first. We've all seen redactions, black bars where meaning goes to die. But one sentence slipped through. Subsurface staging requires synchronized orbital type, one geometry during window. That was a CIA file from a polar brief, half burned, half intact. By 2025, U.S. Space Force planners were using a new phrase too: orbital anomaly detection, deployed alongside AI triage. Not UFOs. Not orbs. Anomalies. The kind you triangulate over corridors nobody's supposed to cross. They built a firewall in 1959 and called it a treaty. Peaceful purposes. Science only. Military support for research, tucked in the fine print. It kept the continent quiet while entrances, if that's what they are, were sealed, logged, and serviced under every carve-out the rules allow. You felt it before you read it. The shift from protection to surveillance sits right where the ice warms. Here's the part they couldn't scrub. Civilian satellites started catching heat plumes, just seconds long, at the edges of declared study zones. Above those times, pilots logged silent triangles holding station. Then the data feeds went dark. Heat. Geometry. Silence. It kept repeating. One pilot who filed after action under initials only said his hands wouldn't stop shaking on descent. Not fear, he said it felt like his bones were ringing. He marked the time, looked down at the yoke, and the sweat on his palm left a perfect triangle on the leather. What happened next wasn't a revelation. It was a leak, a small one, that ruined the protection of the official story. We're going to follow that trail, from the missing lines in the files to the first recorded plume on the ice. And when we get there, we'll ask a question that decides everything. Was this built to shield us, or to keep us out? If you're tracking along in real time, note the windows as we go. Check the coordinates, check the timestamps, and see if your feeds go thin when the ratios lock. The contamination, the first leak. Leaks never explode a story. They contaminate it. One line slips out, and the clean lab of the official narrative goes cloudy. Our first leak wasn't a whistleblower sitting under a spotlight. It was a logistics phrase, a stray survivor in a forest of black bars. Subsurface staging requires synchronized orbital type, one geometry during window. If you know Patrick Jackson's language, type 1 sits high, triangular anchors used to fix a grid. The sentence didn't prove origin or intent, but it suggested coordination between what's above and what's below, at a place built to hide both. To understand why that one line matters, you have to go back to the perfect firewall, the 1959 Antarctic Treaty. On paper, it's elegant, demilitarized, science-led, shared. In practice, it offers threadbare loopholes with real muscle. Military logistics allowed in support of science. Controlled access through inspection regimes agreed by signatories. The effect is the quietest front door in geopolitical history. You can move heavy, call it research, and nobody outside the club gets to look too closely at what's writing on the pallets. Fast forward to 2025. Space Force rolls out an AI plan with careful phrasing. Space domain awareness, orbital anomaly detection, rapid machine learning to triage signals. The terminology stops short of naming spheres, but it rhymes with years of civilian sightings, equilateral formations, layered behavior, and the strange overlap with sensitive corridors. The bureaucracy didn't confess, it adapted. When planners change the words, it's because the world changed first. But words are still theory. Heat is not. The earliest plume that mattered didn't arrive through a secret sensor. It was caught by a civilian satellite watching the West Antarctic edge, close to established research stations and a monotonous, wind-scarred shelf most people would scroll past. 4-6 frames, a tongue of warmth pushed up against a crevasse line like a pulse under skin, then vanished. Meteorology didn't love it, volcanology hated it. The signature was too thin, too clean, too short. If a mantle plume is a campfire, this looked like a match struck in a draft. Meanwhile, something else was happening. A station technician, young, meticulous, the kind who logs glove changes, filled out an incident form about a warm wall along a flagged corridor. He noted the time. Back at altitude, flight crews reported a 3-point formation holding station above that corridor inside the same window. They didn't call them triangles. They logged bearing, spacing, drift, equidistant, stable, silent. By week's end, the station logs had a gap. Not deletion, a pause. No entries for 5 hours. The equipment worked. The paperwork didn't. That technician told a friend later the warmth felt wrong, like standing beside a closed mouth that wanted to breathe. He put his glove back against the seam and said the heat came in a pulse. If you keep notes, mark pulses, count seconds, then check the satellite pass ID for a thin orange lick. Cross-reference the minute. See if your map agrees. This was the moment the official story took on weight. 1 anomaly is noise. 2 is coincidence. Heat plume below, triangle above, blackout between. You don't need to know what it is to sense behavior. And once you sense behavior, the treaty's language reads differently. Military support for science means pallets that don't get questions. Inspection regimes mean schedules you can shape. Peaceful purposes mean silence unless the club agrees to speak. Here's what nobody knew at the time. The phrase that survived redaction, type, 1 geometry, had counterparts in other agencies' polar briefings. Appendices were missing entirely, not just inked out. Footnotes referenced attachments on hold. FOIA denials came back with a carve-out code you don't usually see outside special access programs. You can call that prudence, or you can call it a pattern. When pages vanish, you follow footprints. Those footprints were literal on the ice. Pilots started requesting soft no-fly boxes, near-shelf fractures that had been fair game a season earlier. On the ground, snowcats drove the same lines day after day with no research notes attached, just fuel logs. Technicians who asked why were told to focus on calibration. A week after the first plume, a cargo hop to a coastal strip flew at night, unusual for the route. The next morning, the warm wall was gone. Let's put the pieces in tension. There's a well-documented volcanic story in West Antarctica, Marie Byrd Land, and a mantle plume that pushes heat up under the ice. That's real. It explains broad melt, lake networks, basal lubrication. It does not explain a clean, transient filament of warmth pressing against a corridor for half a minute while a fixed triangular geometry holds above it, and then a local data silence. This is where contamination becomes pressure. The official vocabulary, scientific operations, logistics support, can carry almost anything until it collides with timing. That's what changed in 2025 across the sky. Space Force didn't admit a network, but it armed itself to parse one, in real time, with autonomy. Orbital anomalies isn't a confession, it's an operating concept. And operating concepts have budgets, drills, and tasking. Where do you test those? In the quietest air on Earth, shielded by a treaty built for peace and used for privacy. The first leak wasn't information about what's under Antarctica. It was the realization that the polite firewall had been working exactly as designed, keeping conflict out and scrutiny down while an ecosystem of exceptions matured. You can call that necessary. You can call it ominous. What matters is that the sequence we're tracing, heat, geometry, silence, didn't stop. It was about to repeat in places that don't forgive coincidence, and each repetition would force a harder question. Are we watching a defensive system flex, or a gate being serviced? The CIA's missing page problem. To see how the story starts erasing itself, you have to hold the paper in your hands. Not the rumor, paper. The CIA's declassified copy of John Thomas's The Adam and Eve story is thin, oddly thin for a book that set off so much talk. The agency's FOIA log shows the flood of requests, original manuscript, unsanitized pages, attachments. Yet what you get is a 57-page skeleton with blank stretches where arguments should be. It's a cataclysm thesis, yes, but what matters here isn't the theory. It's the pattern. In polar-adjacent files, the redactions multiply. Whole appendices referenced in footnotes simply aren't there. Annex B on hold, over and over. You're not staring at black bars. You're staring at a table of contents that points to doors walled over. Here's the line that changed everything because it survived. Subsurface staging requires synchronized orbital type, 1 geometry during window. It didn't appear in a UFO folder. It sat inside a logistics stack tied to polar operations. The terms weren't mystical, they were practical. Staging implies movement from one environment to another, not theory but throughput. Synchronized means timing isn't optional. And type, 1 geometry, echoes the classification used by independent trackers for high-altitude triangular anchors. No origin claim. No craft named. Just a requirement statement that assumes coordination above and below, during a defined window, in a place most people will never see. When FOIA officers say no, they rarely say it the same way twice. In polar requests, denials came back with carve-out codes you usually meet in special access programs, operational equities, foreign liaison sensitivity, ongoing technical collection. For polar research? That's the tell. If this were only about ancient disaster narratives, the CIA could shelve it with historical curiosities. Instead, you find threads tied to contemporary operations, logistics routings, inspection schedules, satellite tasking. And wherever those threads run south of 60 degrees south, the paper thins. Across agencies, the missing page motif repeats. Airframes are redacted, procurement lines are intact. The number of pallets clears, the cargo content vanishes. In one set, a routing slip references thermal mitigation at ingress, then the attachment is absent. In another, a briefing index labels subsurface power redundancy as Tab D. Tab D is not releasable at this time. You can call it bureaucratic caution. But when the omissions cluster around the same concepts, subsurface, ingress, thermal, geometry, you stop seeing ink and start seeing shape. Now layer in something older and louder, the Antarctic Treaty's inspection rules. On paper, any party can inspect facilities, ensuring compliance with peaceful purposes. In practice, inspections are scheduled, courtesy-based, and logistically dependent on host support. That means calendar influence, route control, and curated access. It's cooperation, yes. It's also an opportunity to keep certain corridors quiet on certain days. The files don't say it outright. The gaps suggest it. A footnote cites an inspection deconfliction matrix. The matrix is missing. Another cites airspace advisories during heavy traverse. The advisories list is incomplete. Silence is a kind of language, and it's speaking logistics. Take the surviving logistics line and read it beside the station incident you heard earlier. A warm wall, a sealed corridor, and a triangular formation holding station above the same window. Subsurface staging requires synchronized orbital type 1 geometry. If the ground is moving men or material through a node, a fixed anchor overhead would give you precision, positioning, timing, maybe shielding. That doesn't prove non-human tech. It doesn't have to. It shows system behavior, alignment across domains to protect a function, using vocabulary scrubbed of anything that would trigger the tabloids. There's a temptation to force the John Thomas redactions to explain Antarctica directly. Don't. Keep the categories clean. The sanitized book tells you how far the agency is willing to go to control narratives with civilizational implications. The polar files show you how far multiple offices go to control visibility with operational implications. The connective tissue isn't content, it's method. Missing pages, delayed annexes, euphemistic headings that carry extraordinary ideas under ordinary words. Thermal mitigation absorbs warmth. Type 1 geometry stabilizes the sky. Staging becomes the only honest noun in the room. What nobody outside the rooms could see in real time was the way those methods converged in 2025. The Space Force AI plan formalized anomaly detection at orbital scale. The National Archives mandate expanded UAP records collection without forcing release. ARRO denied extraterrestrial tech while acknowledging persistent unknowns. Meanwhile, FOIA replies on polar corridors grew slower, thinner, more coded. The public heard contradiction. The paper trail shows choreography. Admit the category, deny the conclusion, expand the sensors, tighten the pages. So you work like a field tech. You don't argue with redactions. You map around them. Where appendices vanish, you mark the verbs that remain. Requires. Synchronizes. Mitigates. You diagram those verbs against the three-part pattern that keeps returning on the ice. Heat, geometry, silence. And a story starts to outline itself, not in claims but in requirements. Something below needs time and shielding. Something above provides alignment. Something in between, policy, practice, treaty, keeps the corridor empty when it matters. That's the missing page problem. It isn't that truth was blacked out. It's that truth was routed around, leaving just enough verbs to do the job and just enough gaps to keep everyone looking anywhere but the entrance. The entrance that wasn't there, then was. While that first logistics verb sat on a desk in Virginia, boxes were being drawn on maps a world away. Not the red danger polygons tourists see, but thin, faint no-fly/no-step rectangles that moved. They'd sit off the shoulder of an ice shelf for a week, drift 20 kilometers inland, then vanish from notice to airman updates as if the wind carried them off. Pilots said they weren't prohibitions, just advisories. Ground crews called them courtesy blanks. On the charts, they floated like paper doors no one would admit to installing. Across the 2024 to 2025 season, those boxes started arcing along the western shelves, always in adjacency to research stations, but never overlapping them. Meanwhile, civilian thermal satellites, low-res, open feeds, kept biting the edges of that geometry. The captures weren't dramatic. Imagine a faint vein of warmth brushing a crevasse face for seconds, then cooling back into the background. You could scroll past and never see it, but when analysts overlaid the frames on flight advisories, the timing linked up. Box on, brief warm lick along a fracture, box off. If natural, it was a coincidence that respected paperwork. Technicians felt it first. Microstory: a plumber-grade mechanic at a coastal station walks a flagged corridor at night, checking for frost heave. His glove picks up heat along a seam where a maintenance tunnel meets raw ice. He radios it in with the tone of someone who knows better than to editorialize. By morning, his name is on a debrief list. He swipes his badge. The corridor is sealed for calibration. 2 days later, his incident entry is folded into a general work order with 3 new signatures. He's rotated to fuel duty for the rest of the month. Unknown to them, across town, a team in a neighboring module is told to shut laptops, pull battery, and step outside while a comms rehearsal runs. Overhead, a triangular alignment holds steady in the upper dark. The station camera looking west shows stars. The camera pointed at the corridor shows nothing. Someone left its lens cap on. This is not proof. It's choreography, or the impression of it. That begins when people write down what they saw with mittens on. A medic who stepped out without her parka said the air tasted like coin for exactly 3 breaths. She counted, because counting was the only control she had. If you're logging along, tag that kind of detail, breaths, beats, threes, and match it to microwave ticks if your receivers caught them. The entrance talk didn't start with sightings. It started with boxes. A traverse team mapped a laced route around a set of no-step rectangles that hadn't existed on last season's briefing. The path skirted a crevasse zone that every veteran on the team knew like a scar. As they drove, they logged a new field, ad hoc buffer, a 300-meter halo around the rectangle's corners. Nobody told them to add it. It was the distance their bodies insisted on keeping from lines that weren't supposed to be there. Here's where it gets messy. A contractor posted a blurry still of a warm wall event to a private chat. The image resembled a smear of orange along a blue-white face, time-stamped inside one of those boxes. The post was deleted. The account was shut. Someone else reposted it with arrows and claims about doors and ducks. This is where certainty dissolves into content. But while everyone argued about pixels, the station logs quietly documented that the same night a crew from a different country requested access to a tool crib they'd never used. The request was denied. Critical maintenance underway. There were witness recalls that don't reconcile. One engineer described a sealed corridor that hummed like a server room for 20 minutes. Another swore the sound was wind under a door. A medic said the air tasted metallic on her tongue and called it stress. A traverse driver wrote that his fingers went numb on the wheel and came back tingling, like they'd fallen asleep standing up. These are human senses in a place that punishes them. Meanwhile, the verifiable station telemetry shows a brief, localized draw on auxiliary power, enough to drive pumps, not enough for spectacle. When the load dropped, so did the heat frames. The rectangle slid downrange by morning. If you've ever had your gear buzz for no reason, put a pin in that minute. Check the advisory drift and the closest crevasse face on your map. See if the seam and the schedule met each other. A week later, a visiting scientist asked why their drone survey couldn't include a specific fissure track clearly inside the declared study zone. The liaison smiled and offered a different, equally interesting target. That's how it works when an entrance isn't there, until it is, in a way that never reaches a map. Thermal capture teams notice something else. Not just warmth, but regularity. The brief, warm wall events clustered against crevasse faces with consistent offsets from station tunnels. 37 meters here, 39 there, always inside a tolerance band that made engineers lean forward. If a tunnel needs to meet an ice face for interface, you don't cut straight through. You bond. Heat the skin. Let it take. Then you stop before it runs. The captures looked like that. Controlled. Bounded. The signature of a process, not a leak. Debates flared about volcanism, and they should. West Antarctica sits on a hot spot. But hot spots don't respect human schedules. They don't switch on for 180 seconds when a cargo hop takes off at 2:10 and let go when a triangle above drifts to a new azimuth. Mantle heat is weather. This was a clock. Skeptics filed the proper counter. Station infrastructure bleeds heat. True. Diesel burns, shelters radiate, trenches vent. That's why the analysts filtered for station adjacency and found their plumes hugging far edges beyond normal waste. They filtered for wind and still saw the lines appear cross-breeze. They filtered for sun angles and winter erased the alibis. So the phrase entrance changed meanings. Not a door you could rap with your knuckles, but a system's edge, where underground meets ice, warm just enough to mate, then hidden under treaty, practice, and routine. It wasn't constant. It appeared. It performed. Then it left as if it had never been there. And that's when the triangles above made the most sense, not as vehicles, but as templates holding a plane steady while a process below took place. The entrance wasn't there. Then for a breath it was. Then the continent went back to sleep. Boreholes, blue ice, and power that shouldn't be there. To explain the warm wall that appeared and vanished like a breath, we need to look at what's beneath the surface that we do know about. Boreholes, blue ice, and the way power behaves in a place designed to make power scarce. Official projects drill down for climate cores and basal water. The maps show where the bits came up, how deep the strings went, who signed the lab chain. But alongside those charts sits a quieter ledger. Holes that were widened after the science moved on, trenches that stayed open longer than fuel budgets explain, and outflow patterns that turn against the wind for minutes at a time, and then snap back like a rubber band. Blue ice fields are supposed to be honest. Wind ablates snow, old ice resurfaces, and you can land a ski plane on history. Out here, pilots trust that plain logic. The trouble starts when a field that's flown cold for seasons suddenly registers a slick sheen on infrared like a plate warming under a lamp. Not a hazard notice, not meltwater, just a narrow, local shift in emissivity that says something down there changed temperature briefly, then lied still. When techs walked those zones, their boot edges picked up rime that refroze faster than it should have, as if the air had just been tugged warmer and let go. One pilot who taxied through a blue ice window came off the brakes with his wrists buzzing. He held his hands up and laughed, then realized they were still trembling 10 minutes later. He circled the minute in his notebook and wrote 3 words. Not the cold. If you've got access to IR, check that timestamp against the sheen. See if your frame caught the same plate-warm glow. Everyone on the ice learns to count diesel by smell. You know the days burn without a meter. That's why the spreadsheets matter. A station logs a standard draw, heaters, labs, comms. Then, on nights aligned with those courtesy blanks, the tanks dip a notch further without a corresponding spike on any recorded load. It's nothing you'd notice in a city. It's glaring when every barrel means survival. Power that shouldn't be there, then isn't, with no story on the clipboard to carry it. There's a difference between station noise and instrument noise. The first is generators, doors, human life. The second is the hiss in your data that seasoned analysts forgive. Here's the pattern nobody wanted to own. During auroral quiet hours, those rare settled windows when the sky softens and equipment sighs, microwave bursts crept into passive receivers set for entirely different work. They were short, tight in band, and mirrored in 2 sites separated by line of sight to the same stretch of shelf. The bursts lined up inside the same minutes that thermal filaments brushed those crevasses. Not radio chat. Not weather. A pulse with purpose and a schedule. Before you swing for aliens, remember how networks work. If you wanted to shepherd a process at the ice, subsurface interface, you'd need coordination that doesn't rely on a tower. A tight microwave handshake could do it. Wake the node, hold the timing, shut it down before anyone's screensavers wake up. Some people will tell you it's just stray emissions from lab gear. Maybe. But lab gear doesn't choose the quietest sky on the calendar to whisper across 2 stations that don't share an experiment. Meanwhile, the blue ice story kept misbehaving. A field team flagged a crystalline window that looked ordinary until a magnetometer swung past. The needle jerked. Nothing dramatic, no superhero moment, just a crisp deviation that evaporated when the team stepped back 6 strides. The ground had no metal trash, no buried gear, no reason to hold a field like that. They chalked it up to the instrument. A week later, a second team traced the same kink, plotted it, and found the bend sat dead on the edge of a rectangle, that had drifted there overnight on the pilot advisories. Boreholes complicate this, because boreholes are supposed to explain anomalies. And many do. You can read the chemistry and know when basal water is moving, when geothermal flux gets ambitious. West Antarctica has real heat under it, but drill logs tell their own side channel. A core that should have been continuous came up with a polished ring in an interval no one planned to melt. The excuse was friction. The photo looked like contact. If you needed to yoke ice to a structure with minimal trace, you'd heat just enough to bond and let ambient cold take over. That ring was a scar of process, not a mistake. In the ops room, diesel usage argued with measured warmth. The math refused to meet in the middle. If a station dumped extra heat to make a warm wall, the waste should find you elsewhere, vent stacks, sleeping quarters, anywhere the physics leak. It didn't. The warmth lived at the edge and nowhere else, as if the source sat below the ledger that counts kilowatts. Either the station ran a secret generator on fairy tales, or the power came from a line that isn't on the diagram. Here's a microstory that never made it into any report. A comms tech sat through a midnight rehearsal, with live radios turned to dead. He watched a counter on a testing rig tick up in threes, pause, and tick again. Outside, the sky looked normal. Inside, the tick matched nothing in the room. He wrote clock noise beside the entry. He was rotated out before he could run it again. Weeks later, a different tech saw the same ticks at another site at the same minute stamp. Separate rigs. Same rhythm. If you're hunting networks, you don't ignore clocks. They're fingerprints. Skeptics are right to demand separation between station infrastructure and alleged subterranean lines. So mark the separations. The diesel dips without corresponding station loads. The microwave bursts during quiet hours, mirrored across distance. The thermal filaments hugging crevasse faces beyond normal heat bleed. The magnetic kink on a blue ice window that matches a drifting rectangle's edge. Each piece has a station explanation until you stack them. Then the stack draws a silhouette, no one listed on a site map. Power that shouldn't be there doesn't mean magic. It means supply we didn't account for, tuned to appear only when certain geometry holds. If the triangles above are templates, then the pulses below are their echo, a handshake across ice and airtime to windows chosen by people who never use the word entrance in print. What we're seeing isn't a new energy source announced with fanfare. It's an old rule of hidden work. Move quietly, borrow from what's already there, and leave the surface looking like weather. The sphere network overlay. To make sense of heat that behaves like a clock, you have to lift your eyes. Patrick Jackson's layered model gives you a working map. Type 3 near the ground, scanning and reacting. Type 2 spanning corridors, relaying and stitching. Type 1 high above, forming those broad, equilateral anchors that look like triangles to anyone watching from below. Whether you agree with Jackson's origins or not, the structure organizes the mess. It turns scattered sightings into a system that can overlay what we're seeing on the ice. Start with Type 1. Independent trackers flag geometric stability at high altitude over polar routes. 3 luminous points holding fixed ratios while everything else drifted. When analysts ran the spacing through trilateration math, the distances fit positioning logic, not spectacle. Think surveyors extending a base to measure a target, not pilots showing off. Now match those windows against the courtesy blanks that floated over shelf edges. The alignments didn't always appear, but when they did, the triangles held position through the exact minutes when the thermal filaments brushed the crevasse faces. It read like a lock. Jackson's framework calls Type 2 the bridge layer, the mid-altitude mesh stitching the planet from treetop to the rim. Over Antarctic launch corridors and cargo routes, that bridge showed up as arcs, silent, evenly spaced points that tracked along the edge of no-fly advisories, then settled when the advisories froze. Pilots called them pacing lights out of habit. Their logs used better words: equidistant, stable, parallel drift. If Type 1 set the plane, Type 2 drew the lines. Type 3 is where people get nervous, because it lives at human height. The ground-level orbs, if that's what they are, rarely show themselves in polar footage. But the physiology echoes elsewhere. Dizziness, metallic taste, brief disorientation. Effects documented near alleged close-range Type 3 encounters in other regions. I'm not telling you those cases prove anything here. I'm saying that when a medic on the ice writes, "air tasted metallic," in the same night a warm wall event appears and a quiet microwave pulse ticks in threes, the model gives you a slot to place it. Local emissions tied to a node moment. This is where the Space Force language shift matters. In 2025, planners formalize orbital anomaly detection and build AI to triage signals across orbital layers. They don't use Jackson's labels, but their operating concept mirrors his stack: high-altitude anchors, mid-layer meshes, and ground echoes that need fast classification. Over the poles, geometry becomes not just a description, but a requirement. Triangles don't decorate the sky, they make windows possible. Watch how trilateration keeps sneaking in. 3 points fix a position, more points add integrity. Over the western shelves, high-altitude triangles stabilized while mid-layer arcs drifted into place, and below them, rectangles on pilot charts slid like chess pieces to form courtyards. Heat pulsed at the edges, then everything lifted away as if released. System behavior again: template locks, process runs, field clears. If you strip the myth from it, the pattern looks like any complex overlay: signal, confirm, execute, exit. Skeptics argue this reads like pareidolia, human pattern finding on a planet of coincidences. Fair. So push the math. Independent analysts framed specific cases. Type 1 spacing ratios remained constant across varying apparent sizes, implying altitude changes at fixed geometry rather than objects flying in formation to impress. Type 2 arcs preserved equidistance under crosswinds. The repeats aren't visual flukes, they're constraints consistent with measurement functions. Put that above a time thermal interface, and the simplest interpretation is coordination, not theater. The overlay also explains why the entrance was never a door. In a grid, a node is a function, energy, comms, logistics. Surface adjacency is incidental, timing is everything. You don't open a hatch, you open a window. Type 1 holds the frame, Type 2 carries the signal, Type 3 handles the handshake near the skin. The warm filaments aren't leaks. They're signatures of a bond being made and unmade under alignment. This is where the treaty's quiet power shows. You don't need a conspiracy to hide a system. You need scheduled advisories, plausible logistics, and a sky nobody argues over. The Antarctic inspection regime gives you deconfliction on paper. The language of support to science gives you forklifts and pallets that don't invite questions. The Space Force AI plan gives you eyes trained to see geometry as operationally relevant without naming it. Layer those frames, and a planetary grid can work through the poles without a press release. Meanwhile, every 30 seconds, you should ask if the story still holds. Here's your check. Remove origin claims. Remove intent. Keep only behaviors we can describe: high altitude, triangles holding fixed ratios over declared windows, mid-layer arcs pacing advisories, ground-level pulses and brief physiological reports aligned with those windows, thermal filaments touching crevasse faces inside the same minutes, and station logs pausing when timing demands it. Then note that 2025 doctrine upgrades Anomaly triage, because the sky now contains structured events that resist old labels. That's the overlay. Not a confession, a map. Above aligns with below when the window opens, and when the work is done, the geometry lifts and the ice returns to silence. If the grid is real, Antarctica reads like an anchor, not a myth. And anchors, by design, hold more than their own weight. If you're building your own overlay, drop pins, not poems. Ratios, pass IDs, coordinates. Check the coordinates every time a corridor gets a new name. See if the anchor follows you from season to season. Tunnels under silence, the subsurface puzzle. If warmth brushes the ice like a hand, what's the hand attached to? To answer that, we look for patterns below ground, where tunnels are known, where they're rumored, and where profiles repeat in ways that don't care about borders. Start away from Antarctica, so we don't contaminate the logic. Utah, Turkey, Argentina. 3 places with very different histories and the same recurring profiles. Straight-run corridors that hold grade longer than natural caves do, shafts that drop clean before branching into grid-like nodes, and sidewalls that sometimes carry dark, fused bands as if heat once slicked them into glass and then left. In Utah, survey teams found stretches reinforced like someone expected them to last a century. In central Turkey, old cities honeycomb rock, and newer cuts travel in arches too regular to be erosion. Argentina adds the vertical, shafts opening into rooms laid out like a lattice. Law enforcement has its own tunnels, human-made, for smuggling, so we don't confuse categories. Those are documented: rails, pumps, ventilation cobbled together from catalogs. The contested ones, straight runs at depth with fused margins and magnetically active flex pressed into their walls, don't carry receipts. Samples in a few cases tested odd, but not decisive. Geologists offered rare thermal explanations. Researchers argued for energy traces. Both agreed more lab work was needed. Take those features and hold them beside what expedition leads quietly described in zones near the ice. Shaft profiles that drop neatly before leveling into right-angled runs. Interior bands that look scorched under oblique light. And scattered metallic grains that clung to a magnet like dust that forgot it was rock. In every case, the claims outrun peer review. That's the caution. But the profiles rhyme. The distances between nodes repeat within a range. The curvature of certain bends stays gentle enough for maintenance vehicles that don't exist on paper. Restricted ice caves further complicate the picture. On maps, they're flagged for safety, fragile ceilings, risk of collapse, protected paleoclimate layers. All valid. Yet several of the most carefully managed voids sit as convenient masks over the same crevasse faces, where those thin thermal filaments lick and fade. When a corridor needs cover, a natural melt channel does the job without a construction crew ever lifting a shovel. You don't cut a door, you inherit one and tend it. Don't conflate everything underground with everything unusual. Criminal tunnels are real and ugly, a reminder that humans engineer beneath our feet without mystery. Ancient complexes in places like Cappadocia prove people lived underground for reasons as practical as survival. Those truths sit beside the contested claims. So we separate them, then look for overlap that doesn't depend on belief, geometry, materials, and budgets. Geometry first. Across Utah, Turkey, and Argentina, independent teams measured recurring spans between nodal rooms, as if a template dictated spacing. When cave maps from polar traverse debriefs leaked into specialist forums, anonymized, stripped of coordinates, the same spacing reappeared in sketches of forbidden ice corridors. Not identical, but inside tolerance. If you're building a network for maintenance by modular kit, you don't reinvent distance. You repeat it. Materials next. Claims of metallic flecks embedded in tunnel walls show up in field notes from multiple continents. In labs that agreed to test them, some flecks behaved strangely under low-field magnets and showed microstructures not typical of mine residues. Others were mundane. Without chain of custody, the debate stalls. But in polar maintenance logs that escaped full redaction, two lines sit side by side, abrasive reclaim and magnetic capture. You most often see that pairing in facilities that chew through composite materials and need to recover valuable dust before it fouls pumps. Tunnels under ice shouldn't need that, unless equipment passing through them does. Budgets speak. When ground goes quiet, inspection carve-outs under the treaty allow movement for support to science that can include heavy equipment if the forms are clean. Review the seasons when courtesy blanks, multiplied, and thermal filaments brushed crevasse faces. In the same windows, procurement lines ticked upward for specialty abrasives, power redundancy modules, and portable mitigation housings, phrases that wouldn't raise an eyebrow anywhere else. In Antarctica, where every kilogram demands justification, the words feel heavier. Restricted ice caves and historic melt channels as plausible covers make operational sense. You can pass a cable or a fluid line along a frozen vein without cutting a new bore. Brief heat at the interface bonds the path, then you let ambient cold set it. That might explain why those bands and contested tunnels look like someone ironed the stone and walked away. Meanwhile, technicians whisper micro-stories that we can't verify but can situate. A line of crates marked as filters travels midnight to a utility module, then vanishes from manifest. A shaft rumor spreads after a night when ground-penetrating radar timed out over a fracture and the operator was told to reclassify the data as spurious reflectors. The next week, a traverse detours around a new buffer rectangle, and a mechanic is told to stop asking if the ice sings. If your crew runs GPR, tag your dropouts. Note the lat long and the clock. Later, check if a courtesy blank drifted over the same coordinates. Patterns hide in polite paperwork. This is where the puzzle refuses to assemble cleanly. Some tunnels are ours, banal and documented. Some are ancient, sacred, and mapped by archaeologists. Some are rumors that collapse into internet varnish when you touch them. But the subsurface profile that repeats, the drop, the grid, the fused band, the flex, the spacing, keeps showing up where the geometry above demands a window below. If above aligns with below, then the tunnels matter more than we thought. Not as evidence of a civilization, but as quiet infrastructure serving a system that doesn't need us to name it to keep operating. When ground goes quiet, budgets and behaviors carry the torch. And every time a rectangle drifts across a shelf and a warm wall breathes against ice, the map of what might be underfoot sharpens. Not into a door with a brass handle, but into corridors of function running under silence, touched only long enough to keep the grid alive. Treaties, carve-outs, and quiet missions. The treaty reads like a lullaby: peaceful purposes, freedom of science, inspections upon request. But buried in its calm is the clause that makes the machine purr. Military personnel and equipment may be used in support of scientific research. That line is the master key. It turns cargo flights into lab resupply, convoys into traverses, and security cordons into safety perimeters. On paper, everything stays clean. In practice, carve-outs multiply, and access becomes a choreography only the signatories can see. Inspections should keep it honest, right? They do on a schedule. Courtesy calls go out. Hosts arrange aircraft, fuel routes. Inspectors tour what can be toured, and at the exact time Windows logistics can bear. It's cooperation with edges you'll never touch. We saw it in the paperwork before we saw it on ice. Inspection deconfliction matrices referenced, attachments missing. Temporary advisories during heavy traverse listed, advisories incomplete. An inspection regime designed to maintain piece doubles as an aperture control, tightening and loosening visibility as needed. Now fold in 2025 culture, the one Space Force helped codify. Their FI 2025 AI plan didn't say Antarctica. It didn't have to. Enterprise AI, rapid adoption, orbital anomaly detection tell you how personnel will think. Digital fluency becomes a mission value. That mindset matters on the ground. A tech trained to triage anomalies stops asking if anomalies exist and starts feeding the pipeline. Meanwhile, civilian reports describe unmarked aircraft touching down near Utah grids, Argentina shafts, and Anatolian valleys during windows crowded with spheres. In each case, uniforms resembled Space Force issue. No mission statements followed. The pattern spoke for them. Commercial partnerships slip in as quietly as a satellite pass. The plan calls out industry. Defense planners integrate commercial imagery, comms, and analytics. It's just modern procurement, until you remember that private sensors capture what governments don't schedule. Fold those feeds into anomaly pipelines, and you've built a shared nervous system. Now when a courtesy blank drifts over a shelf edge, both public and non-public eyes watch it. Only one set writes the report you'll never read. On the ice, quiet missions feel like a weather change. A snowcat detours around a rectangle nobody will admit exists. A drone survey swaps targets the morning of launch. A station declares a comms rehearsal and asks everyone to step outside. None of it breaks rules. All of it redirects attention. The treaty's peace language makes the redirection comfortable. The carve-outs make it legal. The culture makes it normal. Night flights tell the rest. A cargo hop moves at hours the corridor usually sleeps. A ground team logs a brief auxiliary draw with no stated task. Upstairs, a high-altitude triangle holds fixed ratios over a window that started as an advisory and hardened into a plan. Afterward, the entries go sparse. Not erased, just thin enough to pass audit. The next day, an inspection request arrives with dates that neatly avoid every heavy traverse. If you're flying night routes, keep a pen handy. When the ratios hold, write the bearing, the spacing, the drift. Then check if your yoke hand shakes on rollout. Circle the minute. Later, check public advisories for a rectangle that moved while you slept. There's another layer, National Archives and ARRO. Records expansion without release creates pressure without light. Agencies forward UAP-relevant materials while classification holds. Meanwhile, FOIA replies on polar matters draw from equities lists you see in special access programs. Operational sensitive, foreign liaison, technical collection. That's not scandal, it's a signal. The state is telling you the poles are operational space, not just white on a map. Civilian eyes keep the story human. A farmer in Argentina films an orb above a shaft zone. 2 days later, unfamiliar personnel set up portable arrays and leave before dawn. In Turkey, residents see triangular pacing over valleys famous for underground cities, followed by convoys that don't wear local badges. Yutan power techs spot silent lights tracking lines during scheduled maintenance, then find their grid logs scrubbed of timestamps but not totals. None of these vignettes prove an Antarctic node. They prove an operating style: arrive quiet, instrument, depart, and let the treaty-level silence hold. Money leaves fingerprints even when paper doesn't. Budgets for power redundancy modules, portable mitigation housings, specialty abrasives rise during seasons when rectangles drifted and filaments touched crevasse faces. Grants list environmental hardening for comms gear sited at latitudes where auroral quiet hours can be predicted like tides. If you're preparing for anomalies, you harden the edges and practice in the loneliest air you can find. Antarctica is the loneliest air with a legal umbrella. This is where function starts to clarify motive. A shield needs corridors. A surveillance mesh needs corridors too. Both demand carve-outs, scheduling authority, and layered eyes. Everything we've mapped, inspection windows that glide around operations, commercial feeds braided with defense analytics, AI culture normalized across services, and foreign partners brought under the same vocabulary, points to a system preparing to meet anomalies it refuses to name. Whether those anomalies are orbital debris, adversary tests, or a grid no one claims, the preparation looks the same from below. So when a technician feels a warm wall, a triangle steadies the sky, and a station closes a corridor for calibration, understand the frame that made that moment possible. A treaty wrote the silence. Carve-outs wrote the path. Quiet missions wrote the muscle memory. And somewhere in that choreography, a function keeps repeating. Hold the window, do the work, leave no bruise you can't explain as weather. Protection or surveillance, the polar test. If you strip the drama away, the question left on the ice is simple and cold. Protection or surveillance. Both hypotheses explain corridors, rectangles, and geometry. Both can justify a warm wall that breathes for seconds and a station that goes quiet at the worst possible time to ask questions. The polar test is whether the pattern behaves like a shield meant to keep hazards out, or a mesh meant to keep us in line. Start with what a shield would do. A planetary defense has to watch launch clusters, debris cascades, and collision windows that concentrate over the poles. Orbital mechanics drive traffic south when things go wrong. If the grid is a firewall, you'd expect high-altitude Type 1 anchors to steady most when the sky is busiest and riskiest. Constellation deployments, Starship-era mass payloads, fragments blooming after a break. That's exactly when the triangles appear most consistently over polar corridors. Not nightly, but on nights when human activity swells. A shield shows up when the noise spikes. At mid-layer, Type 2 arcs pacing along the edges of courtesy blanks make defensive sense too. If you're about to open a narrow window for a subsurface operation, you don't want stray emissions or stray objects slicing through. A temporary anchor array above could suppress or redirect local signal flow, act like a baffle, while the interface below bonds or passes. Bursts of microwaves in auroral. Quiet hours fit that logic as housekeeping, not aggression. Synchronize, verify, release. Protection leaves fingerprints that look like caretaking. Now weigh the surveillance read. The same geometry, triangles holding steady while no-step rectangles drift and surveys get rerouted, can map to control. A mesh that paces our logistics learns them. A window that opens only when the right pallets arrive can govern movement as much as it protects it. Station logs that thin during critical minutes look less like safety and more like denial of witness. If the system values secrecy over comfort, the people under it will feel managed. Ask yourself, in your own logs, where do the minutes go missing? Check the coordinates where the paper thins. See if the same corners of the map keep getting polite new names. Physiology sits uncomfortably between these frames. Close-range Type 3 encounters elsewhere correlate with dizziness, nausea, headaches, and that metallic taste you heard on the ice. In a defense lens, those are incidental byproducts, unfortunate spill from emissions that keep timing and alignment tight. In a control lens, they're nudges. Keep humans out of the corridor by making the corridor unpleasant. Either way, the pattern privileges function over bodies. Global benefit, local harm, as operating logic. Correlations beyond Antarctica deepen the dilemma. Spheres and triangles cluster near nuclear facilities, proving grounds, energy grids, and busy launch windows. Surveillance would call that coverage. Observe the places that matter, collect telemetry, shadow the arteries. Protection calls it triage. Surge where risk concentrates, where a failure or a collision could cascade into catastrophe. In both reads, the poles are anchor points because overhead is busiest there when danger multiplies. Above aligns with below, because that's where the system has leverage. Timeline matters. Reports of triangular templates and luminous arrays grew alongside human launch cadence. As orbital noise increased after 2023, sightings rose in step. That's consistent with a shield that scales to threat. It's also consistent with a watchman who scales to attention. When Starship tests lofted heavy, triangles steadied above corridors. When debris broke in crowded bands, high-altitude points held ratios as if bracing the frame. The same scenes can reassure or unsettle depending on what you think those anchors do next. Listen to what official language will and won't say. Yarrow denies extraterrestrial tech. Space Force trains for orbital anomaly detection and fields AI to parse structured events. No agency says grid. None says spheres. Yet doctrine now assumes layered anomalies as an operational reality. That shift tells you the system, whatever its origin, behaves consistently enough for planning. Protection and surveillance both require planning. Both love legal umbrellas that let operations proceed without spectacle. On the ground, the paradox becomes personal. A medic tastes metal and chalks it up to stress. A mechanic logs heat and loses access to the corridor. A scientist swaps a survey target and gets a polite smile instead of an answer. These are small harms in service of a larger function the people under the geometry never got to vote on. Even if the network saves lives by damping our broadcast footprint or deflecting hazards, it's still operating through human spaces without consent. The polar test exposes that tension cleanly because Antarctica is designed to keep consent procedural and scrutiny polite. Here's a microstory that carries both reads at once. A pilot requests a minor deviation to avoid thin cloud over a shelf. Control advises holding path due to temporary advisory. Above, 3 points hold constant ratios. Below, a thin thermal filament kisses a crevasse face for under a minute. The pilot lands, unloads pallets labeled environmental hardening. Later, he hears a station corridor sealed for calibration. If this is protection, we watched a firewall breathe during a moment it had to. If it's surveillance, we watched a window enforce itself while a system we don't run did its work. The honest answer may be that it's both. A planetary scale infrastructure can shield and watch in the same motion. It can keep collision debris from multiplying while sampling our reactions to coverage. It can damp our outward noise under a dark forest logic while thinning our presence where nodes live. The grid doesn't need malice to feel coercive. It doesn't need benevolence to save us from the physics we've crowded into orbit. So the polar test reduces to this. Does the pattern reduce risk we can measure, and at what human cost? Antarctica shows the exchange rate starkly. Heat, geometry, silence, each appears when the window opens. What's protected is never announced. What's surveilled is never acknowledged. And both live under a treaty that keeps the quiet soft enough to ignore until your glove touches ice that shouldn't be warm. The dark forest reframed at the poles. Turn the telescope around for a second. We've been talking about corridors, timing, and geometry as if the grid exists only to manage us. But what if the poles are doing something else, something like turning the planet's volume knob down? That's the dark forest idea, not as fiction but as operating posture. In a crowded universe, survival favors quiet. Earth in 2025 is loud. Tens of thousands of satellites, constellations blooming, radar and laser links threading the sky. Our broadcast footprint has never been bigger. Look at where that noise concentrates. Polar routes pull traffic overhead, communication relays swing across high latitudes, and collision windows cluster along paths that lean south. If a system wanted to damp or shape our emissions, the poles are leverage. The sightings echo that leverage. Type 1 anchors fixing geometry during launch surges. Mid-layer arcs pacing along corridors. Brief ground-level pulses when an interface opens. It doesn't read like surveillance alone. It reads like signal management. We're not guessing in a vacuum. Space domain planners put orbital anomaly detection into doctrine because the sky keeps producing structured events that don't fit the old buckets. They build AI because the patterns aren't random, they repeat. What nobody writes in those plans is motive. For that, listen to the timing. When human transmissions spike, mass deployments, orbital raises, debris storms, the geometry steadies over polar bands. Then, in the exact windows we've been tracing, data gaps appear in public feeds and station logs thin. You can call it coincidence, or you can hear damping. Dark forest logic reframes the triangles as valves. 3 points fix spacetime enough to run a process. The mid-layer meshes carry commands that look like short microwave handshakes during auroral quiet. The ground-level exchange, the warm kiss at the crevasse face, could be a local adjustment, a shunt, a phase alignment, a sync. You don't need alien intent to see the function. You need a planet throwing noise into the void and a system that takes responsibility for making that noise survivable. Here's where the argument sharpens. If the poles act as sinks, places where outbound power and inbound hazard get shaped, then inspection deconfliction isn't just secrecy. It's safety. You don't open a node while a cargo hop drifts through. You don't let an unscheduled survey throw a LiDAR pulse into a window designed to hold 3 layers steady. That's a shield's caution, not just a sensor's preference. The pushback is obvious. Why should anyone accept being managed by a system that doesn't explain itself? Because that's how defense often looks when scale outruns consent. The paradox is brutal. The same intervention that could reduce our outward profile during risky periods will also thin human access near nodes. It's not malice. It's trio. And the poles, by treaty, by logistics, by emptiness, are the easiest places to do it without starting an argument. If the planetary shield is real, its manners are cold. It dims our signal at scale and moves us out of the room when it needs to breathe. Check the windows where your world goes quiet. You might be standing under the muffler while it works. Consider a microstory through this lens. A station declares a comms rehearsal. People step outside. Inside the window, 3 points lock, a narrow filament warms an ice face, and passive receivers record a tight pulse mirrored across distance. 5 minutes later, cameras come back on and show nothing. In a surveillance read, that's control. In a dark forest read, it's a controlled exhale, quietly shaping a stream that otherwise broadcasts our mess farther than we intend. Academic debates about silence versus disclosure sound abstract until you put them over ice. In practice, the behavior looks like this. Clamp geometry when the sky grows dangerous, reopen when the noise drops. The poles become signal sinks, places where the grid can catch, phase, and bleed energy away without scorching cities. That doesn't require extraterrestrial authorship. It requires engineering that treats the planet as a single, threaded system with anchor points where coordination is cheapest. That's the dark forest logic with tools on. A planetary shield that turns Earth's volume down just when our constellations get loudest. If you want to test the idea, don't argue it, measure it. Check the cadence. Launches spike, triangles lock, background noise falls faster than the model. Then the window closes and the room warms back to normal. But the dark forest posture goes further. It suggests the grid sometimes aims inward. When triangles pace over nuclear corridors or energy spines during emission spikes, and portable arrays sprout quietly nearby, the intent could be damping, not eavesdropping, reducing spurious emissions that leak into space while balancing flows that might cascade locally. The cost is human discomfort and opaque schedules. The benefit is fewer flares in the archive of anyone listening from far away. Does this absolve the pattern of coercion? No. A firewall that saves your house can still tell you to leave your living room without explanation. The duty we owe ourselves is to measure outcomes. If the geometry's arrivals coincide with fewer near-miss debris blooms, if high-altitude anchors settle most when collision forecasts go red, and if overall outbound signal power trends downward during those windows, then the shield hypothesis earns weight. Meanwhile, the treaty remains the convenient envelope. It keeps the poles calm and the corridors serviceable. It lets inspection regimes glide around operations that need silence. In a dark forest frame, that quiet isn't just secrecy, it's part of the damping function. Keep the human layer still while the planetary layer breathes. So reframed, the poles aren't a mystery box. They're a muffler, a keystone in a grid that prefers harmony over volume. Heat, geometry, silence, suddenly they're not warnings. They're a meter reading dropping towards safe. And the entrance we keep trying to name may be less a doorway than a throat clearing before the planet speaks again in a lower voice. Triangles over white, template or vehicle. High over the shelves, the triangles kept returning. 3 steady points against a field of nothing, holding ratios like a surveyor's kit pressed onto the sky. Pilots talked around them. Pacing lights, they'd say, or stationary stars that shouldn't be, because giving them a name felt like inviting trouble. What mattered wasn't brightness or drama. It was the discipline. Distances locked, angles fixed, drift absorbed without breaking the geometry. That's not accident. That's intent expressed as math. AI systems run by civilian groups started flagging the same thing. Feed them hours of polar footage, and they pull the needles, equilateral arrangements repeating at different scales, returning months apart over separate ranges. The spacing changed in absolute terms, but the proportions held, as if the template resized to keep the same solution. That's classic trilateration behavior. You scale the base, you preserve the angles, you keep the measurement stable even as altitude or target distance shifts. A show cares about appearance. A template cares about function. Then came the scale puzzle. Triangles captured from jets over Alaska looked the same size as ones logged from the Southern Ocean, despite wildly different vantage points. If these were solid vehicles, you'd expect variety. If they're arrangements, nodes locking a plane, uniformity makes sense. The system doesn't need new silhouettes. It needs repeatable scaffolds it can drop into place and lift away without retooling. Witnesses report the same triangle, again and again, because the grid repeats its best tool. Up close, the template complicates people. Pilots like Ryan Graves relayed crews pacing alongside larger, dark forms, blue lights at corners, a violet glow centered like a heartbeat. Civilian teams with thermal drones recorded crisp triangular heat signatures that held edges in wind, then slid away on a diagonal with acceleration that mocked inertia. Some swear they felt their bodies lock in place under a silent pass. Others describe time bending thin, as if a clock stuttered for a few breaths. Put those accounts next to ground-level Type 3 physiology, dizziness, metallic taste, and you see overlap. Maybe it's emissions. Maybe it's field effects. Whatever the cause, the template's presence doesn't ask permission. There's a cleaner reading that doesn't require a single craft. 3 nodes brighten at corners. The gap between them reads as a black body in night sky. Our eyes connect the dots and fill the middle. It looks like a vehicle because our brains hate empty triangles. Analysts comparing multi-angle footage lean there. The body never occludes stars uniformly. The corners stay consistent, the interior wavers. A vehicle would block. An array imprints. Pattern matching caught another repeat. In multiple regions, smaller orbs, Type 3 by Jackson's language, hovered near infrastructure first. Hours later, high triangles appeared above the same corridors. That sequence reads like escalation: local probe, regional bridge, then an anchor template to hold the window. In Brazil, it lined up over energy routes. In Eastern Europe, it traced old bunkers and active airspace. Over white, it fixed above drift and cold, because the pole is less a place than a function. Geometry goes where leverage is high. Then there are the radar gaps. Pilots logged proximity without returns, as if the system lived just left of the instrument's habits. Ground arrays see something. Cockpit scopes see nothing. Eyes see everything. That inconsistency infuriates engineers and delights pattern hunters. But it's consistent with a template designed to anchor a process, not invite interception, bright in bands that support timing, quiet in bands built for control rooms. Skeptics make the strongest point. Triangles invite pareidolia. Camera artifacts, lens flares, Starlink illusions, pick your poison. So investigators stepped around optics. They modeled the spacings. Across sightings, corner-to-corner ratios clustered tight enough to make coincidence sweat. Equilateral with intolerance. The same numbers in the same sky under different seasons. Pair those numbers with windows when thermal filaments kissed crevasse faces and rectangles drifted on pilot advisories, and you stop arguing optics. You start asking why geometry loves a schedule. Microstory. A night over the Ross Sea. A cargo pilot holds a line while a temporary advisory slides inland. 3 points settle ahead. They don't blink. They don't chase. They wait. In his headset, a request to confirm altitude. On his fuel gauge, a burn rate that suggests headwinds that aren't there. He lands. Pallets stamped, environmental hardening roll into a bay. Hours later, a technician at a station 2 shelves away notes a corridor sealed for calibration. Overhead, the triangle lifts as if relieved of duty. If that's a vehicle, it's patient beyond discipline. If it's a template, it just finished being a bolt. The motive question lingers. Template or vehicle decides less than you think. A vehicle implies agency we can point to. A template implies system. Either way, the triangle shows up when the window opens, steadies while the work runs, and leaves no bruise you can't explain as weather. Across continents, over cities and deserts and ice, the same scaffold keeps dropping into view, sized to the job and deaf to our metaphors. Here's the part that matters for what's under the ice. Not a single entrance relied on a door. Every warm wall, event we traced sat inside minutes where triangles held above and mid-layer arcs paced around. The template came first, then the breath against the ice, then the silence. Vehicle is a noun we use when we want a thing to chase. Template is a verb the grid uses when it needs a job done. Over white, the job keeps finding its triangle. 2025, the year the ice started talking. By January, launch cadence stopped feeling like events and started feeling like weather. Whole weeks carried stacked manifests, constellation batches, refuelers, ride shares, and the polar corridors wore the strain. That's when the geometry got busy. Trackers watching the high bands saw triangles settle over the southern routes, not as spectacles, but as metronomes. They'd lock ratios when booster stages crossed certain longitudes, hold through orbital raises, then fade as the sky thinned. Below, those thin courtesy blanks drifted across shelf edges, and the old pattern breathed again. Heat, geometry, silence. Brazil's coastal feeds caught one of the first clean cross-hemisphere echoes. As Starship tests spooled up, cameras in the South Atlantic logged faint equilateral points in the upper dark. Then, hours later, a repeat over the Ross sector. Independent analysts overlaid the launch windows and saw the handshake, a northern surge followed by a southern brace. Meanwhile, civilian satellites bit the edge of West Antarctica and recorded 3 brief thermal brushes against crevasse faces inside those minutes. No drama. Just a pulse, a hold, a release. Near-miss debris windows added pressure. In March, a cloud from an old breakup smeared across a busy altitude band. Amateur astronomers flagged odd steadiness above the southern arc. 3 points holding, distances preserved while everything else drifted like pollen. The next day, public dashboards showed a sharper-than-expected drop in background noise. Attribution wars broke out, models versus coincidences. On the ice, a station log went thin for 4 hours in the same window, and a mechanic wrote "warm seam" in a notebook he didn't file. Starship-era payload surges made the triangles predictable without making them routine. Analysts noticed that when the heavy birds flew, the high anchors scaled, bigger apparent bases, same proportions. Trilateration doesn't care what you call the object, it cares about solving positions. Over Antarctica, those solves lined up with rectangles on pilot advisories and with low-power draws on station ledgers that didn't match declared loads. A narrow filament would touch an ice face for half a minute, then radiation climbed back into the background. The ice had learned a new verb, answer. Official confirmation never arrived. What changed was cadence. Space Force planners accelerated anomaly drills. Civilian pilots filed more stationary lights, reports near restricted corridors, and the phrasing in notices to airmen slid from casual to careful. Advisory became temporary hold. Deconfliction became precision window. The vocabulary didn't confess a grid. It accepted one. A micro-story carried the year's mood. April, over the Pacific approach, a medical evacuation flight requested a minor deviation to dodge. Thin cloud. Control denied. Temporary advisory active. 3 points steadied ahead at high altitude. The pilot logged equidistance and drift, not lights. He landed on time. At a station 2 shelves away, a corridor sealed for calibration. Auxiliary power spiked for 8 minutes, and a thermal satellite caught a faint orange lick along a fracture. No one on the medevac saw heat. No one on the ground saw triangles. The system saw both and moved like it had rehearsed. By May, independent AI models trained on public feeds began flagging repeatable signatures. They didn't call them spheres. They tagged equilateral persistence above polar corridor, mid-layer pacing along advisory edges, and transient thermal at crevasse interface. The timestamps stacked into tidy columns. When the lists reached agencies, the public-facing answer didn't change. Unknowns remain unknown, but tasking did. Portable arrays appeared near shafts in places far from ice, Argentina's interior, Anatolian valleys, Utah's grid lines, within days of polar windows. If 2025 offered proof of anything, it was that the geometry isn't provincial. It scales. June brought an odd inversion. A launch scrubbed late, but the triangle above the Ross held anyway. For 12 minutes, the ratios stayed frozen over a corridor with no traffic to justify the frame. Analysts assumed a model error until a small coastal station reported comms rehearsal, full outage. During the blackout, a technician wrote that the air tasted like coin near a sealed seam. A radio op said his fingers went pins and needles on the transmit key and wouldn't wake up until the lights did. When power returned, the triangle lifted as if it had been waiting to be told to leave. The launch never happened. The window did. If your station ever goes full rehearsal, step outside, count your breaths, and note the minute. Later, check the ratios posted by skywatchers above your latitude. See if their clock matched yours. Mid-year collisions tighten nerves. A defunct bus clipped debris and split. Hours later, 3 points steadied over the southern band, and independent receivers listening in quiet hours recorded a tidy microwave burst mirrored across 2 stations. Not chat, a tick in 3s. As the burst faded, public dashboards showed a drop in measured interference not predicted by models. Station logs for the same window went sparse. Compare the columns, and it reads like maintenance on the sky. By late summer, triangles over white were less rumor than weather. Portable advisories drew corridors no one debated in public, and rectangles slid with a confidence that suggested practice had become policy. Civilian thermal satellites kept catching the margins, the brief, warm wall kisses that bonded ice to whatever lived beneath it long enough to keep a line intact. Crews rotated. Reports thinned. The rectangles drifted on. What made 2025 feel different wasn't one spectacular capture. It was repetition tight enough to plan around. Heat, geometry, silence ceased to be a story and became a schedule. Every time the cadence spiked, launches, near misses, orbital raises, the anchors dropped, the pulses whispered, and the paper went quiet. The ice didn't speak in sentences. It tapped. If you learned the rhythm, you could tell when the grid inhaled. Which is why planners weren't blind. They couldn't be. Whether they named it a shield, a mesh, or an anomaly to triage, the response was the same. Hold the window, do the work, seal the seam, and move. 2025 didn't give us origins. It gave us a clock. And once you hear it, you can't unhear it. Recognition without admission. By fall, the language felt rehearsed. ARRO stood before cameras and repeated the line. No verifiable evidence of extraterrestrial technology. The words were clean, careful, and designed to travel. Yet in the same season, procurement notices hummed with phrases that rhyme with advanced sensing and propulsion, field mitigation, inertial control studies, wideband anomaly triage. None of it said spheres. None of it said triangles. All of it assumed a sky that behaves in structured ways you can plan around. If you watch the dockets like you watch the sky, tag those euphemisms. Then check your window logs. See if field mitigation, money shows up the same quarter your corridors learned the word precision. That's the posture now, recognition without admission. The all-domain anomaly resolution office catalogs, triages, and publishes tallies. It denies the leap while building the ladder. National Archives mandates widen their grip, ordering agencies to forward UA irrelevant records under a presumption of disclosure that rarely reaches daylight. Meanwhile, working groups inside services adopt tools that treat anomalies as a feature of operations rather than a public conversation. You can hear the split in a single hearing. On the microphone, a director repeats the caution. In the record behind the dais, staffers circulate slides with new taxonomies: orbital, transatmospheric, atmospheric, subsurface adjacency. No one lingers on those last 2 words. They just sit there, adjacency, like a thumbprint we aren't supposed to dust. Classified solicitation language delivers the rest in euphemism. High dynamic environment state estimation reads like a math problem until you remember triangles holding ratios above polar corridors. Signature management in cluttered orbital lanes sounds like traffic control until you watch near-miss windows tighten and background noise drop faster than models like to predict. The denials are categorical. The shopping list is practical. There's a reason the gray zone feels livable to the people running it. Coexistence is easier to manage than confession. If the geometry is a system, and the system isn't ours, you do what operators always do. Adapt doctrine, refine sensors, keep public language narrow enough not to trigger panic or overreach. That produces 2 simultaneous truths. 1. The official line remains unchanged. 2. Workflows across agencies now presume repeatable anomalies that demand coordination across air, orbit, and sometimes the ground you can't see on any open map. Whistleblowers complicate the choreography. Some accuse, some speculate, a few bring documents. The RRO's historical review responds with a counter-archive. Balloons, misidentifications, adversarial tech misread through fog. But the posture has already shifted. Even while rejecting recovered craft, the office builds pipelines to ingest civilian logs, pilot reports, and sensor feeds. It denies collaboration and constructs the infrastructure you'd need if collaboration were happening at the level that matters. Operational deconfliction, not handshake photos. Then there's Space Force. The FI 2025 plan never once says UAP. It doesn't have to. AI first enterprise, rapid machine learning adoption, cross-domain anomaly detection, sketch a branch that assumes the sky's grammar has changed. When locals in 3 countries describe portable arrays appearing near hotspots and dissolving by morning, the official answer is silence. The procurement tempo tells you enough. Commercial imagery braided with military tasking, redundancy contracts for high-latitude comms, and training that treats pattern recognition as muscle memory. National Archives policy widened the funnel the same year FOIA replies on polar corridors grew thinner. It's not contradiction, it's staging. Pressure increases. Access narrows. The result is a paper surface that admits categories and conceals specifics, so the public hears a steady denial while planners work from a shared premise. Structured events recur, and those events matter where launch cadence spikes, where debris blooms, and where corridors are easiest to clear without a riot. You could call it cowardice. It reads more like risk management. Inside government, certainty is currency. If origins can't be proven, function becomes the only language safe to spend. So they talk in verbs. Detect, deconflict, stabilize. The nouns, spheres, triangles, grids, stay in witness mouths and analyst notebooks. The verbs move palettes, shift advisories, and time windows to nights when geometry loves the sky. Civilian witnesses interpret this as quiet admission. They see unmarked aircraft, sealed corridors, and returns that vanish from public dashboards while triangles steady over a frozen horizon. Officials insist nothing extraordinary is happening. Both accounts can be true in their lanes. Extraordinary is a word about origin. Operations don't need origin. They need schedules. Here's how the choreography looks when you stop demanding confession. A launch cluster pulls traffic into polar bands. An internal tasker flags elevated risk and triggers a standing play. Portable arrays go up in places that mirror the corridors an ocean away. A high-altitude template holds, mid-layer arcs pace, and a station declares calibration. Public feeds thin, then resume. ARRO logs a structured event at altitude, assigns a provisional bucket, and the press release says the thing it must. Unknown, under review, no evidence of X. The arc back to the ice is short. Geometry steadies, warmth brushes, and a corridor goes quiet under policy that never names the reason. That's recognition without admission at human scale. A medic tasting metal, a mechanic logging heat, a liaison offering a different survey target with a smile. The meaning is routed around. The work gets done. If you want to measure honesty in that posture, count outcomes. The sky grows denser. The triangles arrive more often when it does. Debris windows close with fewer flares than models feared. Public plans harden around anomaly triage. The denials stay crisp. In that friction, the system tells you what it believes about itself. It doesn't need you to agree. It needs the window to hold. The entrance as a system, not a door. We were wrong about the word entrance. Doors imply edges you can touch. What kept appearing on the ice behaved like a node in a network. An interface that wakes only when 3 layers agree. Surface thermal, subsurface geometry, and orbital triangulation. Think of it as a gateway function, not a hatch. When the high-altitude template locks its ratios, when the mid-layer mesh paces the corridor, when a tunnel segment below reaches the crevasse face inside tolerance, the window opens. Heat kisses ice. The handshake completes. Then everything lets go. Stack the layers. On top, the triangle isn't a craft, it's a frame. Its spacing preserves trilateration so timing can be trusted below. In the middle, arc stitch signals around advisories, holding a quiet bubble where misfires won't matter. Beneath, a right-angled run meets the ice wall at a calculated offset and applies controlled warmth. The bond we kept catching as a thin filament on low-res thermal. That bond isn't leak or waste. It's an engineered skin connection that can carry energy, data, or mass for minutes without leaving scars a tourist can film. Here's the night it felt least theoretical. A station alert chimes at 2:06, comms rehearsal, total blackout. People step into the wind with mugs cooling in their hands. Overhead, 3 points steady into an equilateral that's held this corridor twice before. The mid-layer settles into a quiet arc along a drifted rectangle that isn't on any map taped to a wall. Inside the blackout, auxiliary power ticks up like a held breath. In a buried corridor, a seam hums, not loud, a server room murmur someone called wind last time. Along a crevasse face 39 meters from the tunnel bend, a narrow filament glows on a civilian satellite and fades. 5 minutes later, lights return. The triangle lifts. The rectangle slides. In the log, the word calibration gets a date. What function just ran? If you strip intent, 3 possibilities fit the behavior. Logistics, a brief transfer along a bonded skin, fluids, parts, something that likes cold and hates questions. Energy, a pulse shunted through an interface to buffer loads or feed nodes without advertising generators. Communications, a phase-stable link that needs geometry quiet enough to write without smear. The discipline is the tell. Weather throws heat like paint. This writes it like ink. Engineers will ask about cost. Where's the power? Why no plume in vents, no spike in sleepers' bunks? The answer keeps returning to separation. The station ledger breathes one rhythm. The interface breathes another. The extra draw dips tanks and bypasses the rooms we live in. Whatever supplies the bond isn't measured where we keep our comfort. Stakes live in that silence. If this is a control node, the priorities are baked in. Protection over people, function over comfort, schedule over permission. It's hard to swallow until you widen the frame. A node like this anchors a planetary grid. You don't advertise its address. You publish rectangles that drift. You rehearse so the window holds even when a medevac needs a straight line through thin cloud. You call it calibration because that word dies at the doorway. The meaning follows the motion. Heat, geometry, silence. The sequence isn't a rumor anymore. It's a system, and the entrance we kept trying to knock on was never a door. It was a verb the grid speaks when it needs the ice to listen. The smoking pattern, heat, geometry, silence. Here's where scattered scenes become a chain. Not proof of origin, but behavior you can't shrug away. We pulled 3 case sequences where independent data sets overlapped cleanly enough to chart. Heat at the edge, geometry above, and a silence that arrived right when you'd want eyes off the room. Case 1 began on a shelf west of Marie Byrd Land in late March. Public notices drew a narrow temporary hold over a corridor pilots use like a rail. 37 minutes before the window, high-altitude watchers logged 3 steady points settling into equilateral corner distances, preserving ratios while background stars drifted. The same minute, 2 mid-layer arcs paced along the advisory's edges, matched in equidistance, sliding like guards to a doorway. At T+06, a civilian thermal platform caught a single hairline filament brightening along a crevasse face for 42 seconds. Too thin for melt, too local for weather. At ground level, a station's power ledger showed a short dip in tanks without a corresponding room load, logged as auxiliary. During those 7 minutes, public feeds from the nearest webcam looped a still image labeled calibration. Then everything let go. The triangle lifted. The arcs loosened. The thermal returned to blue. In the station log, 2 words, comms rehearsal. Case 2 crossed oceans in April and returned to ice by nightfall. A Starship Heavy lifted on the other side of the world. Independent trackers watched a faint equilateral frame appear. Over the south an hour later, scaled larger but preserving proportions, as if the base length grew to keep the same math at altitude. Below it, rectangles on pilot advisories slid inward and stopped. 2 passive receivers at stations with line of sight to the same shelf recorded short microwave bursts in 3s during auroral quiet. Tight band, mirrored, not chat and not weather. For minutes later, a commercial thermal pass nicked the shelf edge and registered a brief, narrow emissivity rise hugging a fracture line. Meanwhile, an internal maintenance ticket listed portable mitigation housing, operational test, routed through a module that normally sleeps at that hour. The ticket closed with no notes. When the rectangle drifted out, the high anchor faded, and ground-level reports returned to routine. The only human detail left on paper was a medic's line. Air metallic near seam, resolved. You can explain each piece alone. Stacked, they rhyme. Case 3 were denial like a coat. A debris bloom spread in a crowded band in June. Forecasts predicted elevated interference over the southern arc. As models argued, 3 points steadied above that arc and held ratio under skewed winds, equilateral enough to pass any surveyor's grin. Pilots in the region filed avoidance without drama. On ice, a station declared a full blackout, rehearsal for 12 minutes. During the blackout, a fuel figure dropped a notch that didn't map to heaters or labs. Outside, a small team walking a flagged zone found their handheld magnetometer kick once, precisely on the edge of a rectangle that had slid across the advisory the night before. They chalked it up to instrument noise. Hours later, public dashboards showed a sharper-than-modeled drop in background clutter. The blackout log listed nothing but timestamps. The triangle lifted, and the corridor reopened. That's heat, geometry, silence, and cadence. We built these sequences carefully, conservative qualifiers, source context intact. None rely on a single witness. Each links independent threads by time. High-altitude triangles preserving ratios, mid-layer arcs pacing advisories, tight microwave ticks mirrored across distance during quiet, narrow, local thermal filaments touching crevasse faces, and station logs that thin under names like rehearsal or calibration. It's the timing that matters. The geometry steadies when the window opens. The heat speaks in a filament, not a flood. The silence arrives like a curtain call. Then the scene resets. Skeptics asked for ripple effects. We found them at the edges. Flight plans rerouted cleanly around rectangles that drifted like chess pieces. Survey missions swapped targets day of with cheerful notes about weather that didn't show in the archive. A crate line marked filters, hit a midnight manifest, and never appeared on the other end of the ledger, while a week later, a procurement line listed abrasive reclaim, magnetic capture, for modules that don't normally eat composites. Logs inside those windows were not erased. They were thin, totals without timestamps, summaries without steps. You could pass audit. You could not reconstruct a minute by minute. What does that chain mean? Not aliens. Not certainty. It means a system behaves as if a process requires 3 layers to agree and prefers to be alone while it runs. The heat is not waste. It's a signature of contact, an engineered bond at an ice face aligned to subsurface geometry. The triangles aren't a parade. They're a frame that makes timing possible. The silence isn't emptiness. It's an operational choice. Keep cameras looping, keep radios rehearsing, keep people outside until the handshake ends. If you're patient with the caution, the pattern earns more than intrigue. Across months, across shelves, as launch cadence spiked and debris windows crowded, the same sequence kept coming back. It didn't care about our narrative. It cared about its schedule. And when the work was done, the grid left the surface looking like weather. The strongest argument against spectacle is discipline. Weather is sloppy. Theater loves witnesses. This behaved like neither. It ran tight. It ran brief. It left scars you could only see if you layered heat maps, sky geometry, and the places in paper where words thin into euphemism. Heat, geometry, silence, repeatable enough to plan around, deniable enough to ignore if comfort is your job. We said at the start this wouldn't end with a door. The smoking pattern isn't a latch you can slam or a hidden hatch you can film. It's a metronome. If you learn to count its ticks, the rest of the map starts to show. And once you hear that cadence, heat, geometry, silence, you notice how often the ice breathes when the sky above holds its breath for it. The disclosure and the new path. So this is the payoff, and it isn't a single reveal. The entrance we chased was a function all along. A gateway routine that wakes when geometry holds, passes what it needs to pass, then folds back into ice. And paper silence. Call it a note if you want, but the behavior makes the case. When triangles lock, mid-layer arcs pace, and a seam warms for a breath, the pole acts like a control point inside a larger system. Why hide a function? Because the story that follows it is bigger than a door. The grid we've been mapping behaves like a planetary overlay, a mesh that balances risk, noise, and logistics at scales we don't manage. Antarctica sits at the keystone. It offers leverage over orbital traffic, clean corridors for timing, and a treaty envelope that lets windows open without a fight. Above aligns with below not because someone wants mystique, but because alignment is the only way a network this large can keep time. That framing reframes motive. You don't need extraterrestrial origin to see meaning, and you don't need confession to measure impact. The system appears to damp outward noise when cadence spikes, brace corridors when debris blooms, and move material or energy across seams under geometry that solves like math, not myth. Meanwhile, humans under the scaffold feel the cost. Brief interference, sealed hallways, advisories that absorb plans. Global benefit paired with local harm isn't a slogan here. It's a trace on the ledger. Personal stakes live there. Health and autonomy get bumped by timing you don't consent to. A medic tastes metal during a blackout and marks it down to stress. A mechanic watches a filament flare on a thermal feed and is told calibration with a smile. A pilot flies through a hold while 3 points steady above and learns a new vocabulary for quiet. That's not catastrophe. It's pressure, applied in moments that tell you who gets to set priorities when windows open. Where does that leave us? Recognition without admission is the current bargain. ARO tallies and denies. Space Force trains to triage anomalies and never says why the templates keep returning. The archives expand their scope while classification holds the line. That posture won't evaporate under rhetoric. The system doesn't need our names for its parts. It needs us not to break its schedule. So the new path isn't a demand for a press conference. It's groundwork and discipline. Open source mapping that respects what can be verified. Metadata-first submissions, timestamps, coordinates, sensor specs, and chain of custody notes, so a pattern can hold in public without collapsing into wishful thinking. A standing distinction between correlation and causation baked into every post. If you catch a filament, log the pass ID. If you catch geometry, include the ratios. If a corridor goes quiet, preserve the intervals, not just the guess. And as always, check the coordinates. Don't let a good story outrun a clean map. The Shield doesn't argue online, but it leaves clocks you can set your watch by. We'll need a shared map that isn't a vanity wall. A living grid where independent teams submit events. Equilateral persistence over corridor X. Mid-layer pacing on advisory Y, local thermal Z, with provenance. Let the map grade itself. If a claim can't carry its data, it fades. If it aligns with other datasets inside tolerance, it promotes. That's how you cut through the fog without waiting for institutions to bless your eyes. We'll also need a simple language for caution. Contested isn't the same as false. Unverified isn't the same as useless. A window candidate tagged for overlapping events that hit 2 out of 3 signals, geometry, heat, silence, without forcing intent into the record. A node adjacency tagged for infrastructure changes near repeated windows, sealed corridors, shifted surveys, repeated calibration notices, without claiming collaboration. The moment you label motive, you hand skeptics the bat. Label behavior, and the archive builds weight over time. On the institutional side, pressure works best when it's quiet and precise. Ask for narrow things that fit the posture they've already adopted. If Space Force has an AI taxonomy for orbital anomalies, ask for the bins without the contents, definitions, not objects. If ARRO has a historical index that mentions subsurface adjacency, request the glossary terms. If National Archives must build a UAP collection, ask for metadata about files withheld, dates, page counts, equities invoked. Don't chase headlines. Chase columns you can line up with your own. And please don't collapse categories. Criminal tunnels and ancient cities are real in their lanes, and mixing them with node functions helps no one. File smuggler infrastructure under crime. File Cappadocia under culture. Keep polar claims on a short chain, tied to geometry, thermal, and timing. Every time someone floods the feed with myths, a real scene goes undocumented because the people closest to it stop talking. What you can expect next won't look like fireworks. It'll look like clockwork. Launch cadence will surge again. Corridors will harden. Triangles will hold ratios above routes that look boring until you learn the rhythm. Mid-layer arcs will pace advisories that slid overnight. A filament will kiss a seam you can only see on a lucky pass. Station logs will thin, and then the ice will return to silence like it's relieved. That's not new. It's just visible now. So here's the final handoff. If this grid is truly planetary, it won't stop to argue, and it won't wait for our language to catch up. Our choice is simple. Document what it does with enough rigor that meaning survives us. Keep our maps honest. Keep our claims small and sharp. And hold the line between asking for disclosure like a slogan and building disclosure like a record anyone can audit. The story will end up bigger than Antarctica, but the pole is where it taught us its rules. Somewhere out there, under a winter sky with no horizon, 3 points will steady into ratios a surveyor would envy. Somewhere underfoot, a seam will hum just enough to bond a path. Someone will be told to step outside with a mug while the room goes dark. If we're doing our job, there'll be a timestamp, a ratio, a pass ID, and a line on a public map that says, "Window held here." Check the coordinates. Then check your pulse. If both jump at the same minute, you were standing under the shield. That's the new path. Not a door kicked in, but a corridor built in daylight, one verified marker at a time, until the schedule we weren't supposed to see becomes the calendar we all live by. What we called an entrance was a function, a window that opens when heat, geometry, and silence lock into place. If you can verify a window, help build the map. Submit footage with timestamps, ratios, and pass IDs, and add your markers to public grids. Subscribe for the next investigation, and share this with someone who can add clean data. because the only disclosure that holds is the one we can all audit.